Pregnant and widowed, the lonely Orc queen faced an empire that wanted her dead. She was still wearing his ring when they dragged her through the pressure gates. It was a simple thing, hammered iron, slightly too large for her finger because Durin's hands had been enormous, as all things about him had been enormous, and she had strung it on a cord around her neck after the Battle of the Ashfin Crossing, where she had watched the Imperial artillery reduce him to a memory and a smear of green-gray smoke. She tucked it under her collar before the guards could see it. You learned early which things you kept hidden from people who wanted you to have nothing left to lose. The descent in the Imperium's pressurized transport had taken 6 hours. 6 hours in a sealed metal compartment that smelled of recycled air and the particular antiseptic the Veth used on their equipment, a smell she associated with field hospitals and bad outcomes. The 2 guards assigned to her had not spoken. She had sat between them with her wrists in the mag cuffs and watched the porthole go from dark blue to black, to a darkness so complete it pressed against the glass like a solid thing. And she had used those 6 hours the way she had learned to use every quiet stretch of time in 15 years of war. She had planned. Not escape, not yet. She had planned for the conversation she was about to have with the most dangerous man in the Imperium, and she had tried to account for every variable she didn't know, which were most of them, which was why the planning had kept her occupied for the full 6 hours without resolution. She was not afraid. That was not strictly true. She was afraid in the specific functional way that keeps you alive, the way fear operates when you've trained it out of the paralyzing register and into the useful one. She had learned to do that in the first year of the war, when she was 23 and commanding a border garrison, and the Imperium was a rumor that turned into a column of assault vehicles at 4 in the morning. 15 years of being afraid in useful ways had made her very good at it. It was not something she was proud of. It was just a thing that was true about her now. The city was called Vel Sarath in the old tongue of the Veth Imperium, which translated loosely as the heart beneath. Vera had learned enough Veth over 15 years of war and diplomacy and desperate back-channel negotiation to know the phrase carried a double meaning. It could also mean the buried secret, and standing now in the entrance causeway with mag cuffs on her wrists and the smell of sulfur and brine thick in her throat, she thought that was probably the more honest translation. Vel Sarath existed 12 kilometers below the surface of an ocean that had no name on any map she had ever owned. The Imperium had built it over the course of 3 centuries in a volcanic shelf above a geothermal vent complex, powering the whole impossible structure with heat-to-energy converters the size of city blocks. The ceiling was a dome of engineered rock 200 meters above the highest spire, and it pressed down on you even when you weren't looking at it. The light here was wrong, a deep amber yellow that made everyone look slightly jaundiced, slightly unwell, slightly not quite alive. There were 12,000 people living in this place. Most of them had been brought here the same way Vera had. "You will not speak unless spoken to," said the guard to her left. He was Veth, tall, bone pale, with the characteristic feathering behind his ears that stiffened when he was being authoritative. His feathers were very stiff right now. "You will address the Imperator General as Exalted Vorin. You will answer any question he asks with complete accuracy, and you will not attempt to deceive, obfuscate, or delay. These are the terms of your detainment." "I've been detained before," Vera said. "Not like this." She didn't argue with that. She was 6 months gone with her daughter. She had not told the Imperium this. She had worn her heaviest traveling coat to obscure it, and the mag cuffs were wrist, only rather than full-body restraint, which meant either they hadn't noticed or they had noticed and didn't care. She suspected the latter. To the Imperium, an Orc queen was a diplomatic problem or a propaganda opportunity, never a person. Her daughter was neither yet. They walked her through the lower market district first, deliberately, she understood. A show. Vera walked straight back through the stares of several hundred Atlantean citizens and 24 Veth overseers, and did not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She had walked through worse crowds with less dignity and tact. The market sold food synthesized from plankton cultures farmed by the labor class of Vel Sarath, the ones the Imperium called the Urkin, which was a Veth administrative term meaning roughly the substrate people, those whose work formed the foundation. Before the market, though, there had been the pit. This was the part they had clearly enjoyed. A junction hall on sub-level 2, with a reinforced observation grate in the floor and a 2-meter drop into a pressure-sealed holding tank for the creatures the Veth used as a secondary security deterrent. Massive, pale, cartilaginous things that moved with the slow, absolute confidence of animals that had never encountered anything capable of threatening them. They were not sharks in any taxonomy she knew, but the principle was identical. Teeth, water, the patient arithmetic of predation. 2 guards had suspended her over the grate on a cable harness and left her there for 10 minutes while a Veth administrator read her the terms of her detainment in a tone of complete administrative boredom, as though what was happening was a formality rather than a threat. She had looked down at the pale shapes moving through the water below her and had thought, this is the part where you show them you're not afraid of this, specifically. She had thought about Durin, who had faced worse than a cable over a tank of something toothy. She had thought about her daughter, for whom she was currently the entire world and who deserved a mother who didn't give the Veth the satisfaction of screaming. She had not screamed. They had put her back on solid ground with the expression of people who had expected a different reaction and were mildly inconvenienced by not getting it. She filed that away. People who expect fear and don't get it generally recalibrate in one of 2 directions. They either respect you or they decide to make you afraid in a more effective way. She would find out which. She knew them by the marks on their hands. 3 shallow cuts on the back of the left wrist, the old cattle brand of the Imperium's labor induction protocol, signifying that you had been processed through a modification center and were now biologically equipped for underwater work. Plastic composite gill structures grafted to the neck, membrane lenses over the eyes, metabolic suppressors to allow extended deep-water activity. Vera had read the clinical summaries in captured Imperium field reports and thought them the most chilling documents she had ever encountered, rendered in the absolutely bloodless language of logistics. The Urkin who worked the market stalls looked at her differently than the Veth overseers did. Some of them looked away immediately, but a few, a woman near a plankton-bread cart, a young man unloading a harvest crate, held her gaze for a fraction longer than safety allowed. It was a very specific look. She had seen it in every occupied territory the Orc sovereignty had ever tried to reclaim. The look that said, "You are not supposed to exist." The look that said, "Please be what we think you are." She kept her face neutral. She didn't know yet if she could be what they needed. She was trying to survive the next 20 minutes first. Exalted Vorin occupied what had once been the city's ceremonial chamber, a vast hexagonal room with walls of polished volcanic glass, and a floor inlaid with the Imperium's territorial maps, showing in pale blue relief every system and world under its domain. There were many worlds on that floor. Vera walked across 3 of them on her way to the center of the room, and thought about how the craftspeople who made this floor had probably believed that walking on conquered worlds was a symbol of power. She thought it was probably a symbol of something else. Vorin himself was at the far end, standing with his back to her when she entered, examining something on a data table. He was not what she had expected from the briefings. She had expected the Imperator General to be theatrical. The Veth leadership often was, all ceremony and elevated phrasing and dramatic pausing. Vorin was compact, quiet, wearing a plain field uniform rather than the decorative command armor she had seen in the propaganda images. He was older than the images suggested. His feathers had gone the pale gray of age, lying flat against his skull. He turned around. Queen Vera of the Second Sovereignty, widow of the warlord Durin, commander of the Ashvin line until its dissolution 3 months ago. He recited this not like an indictment, but like a recitation of facts he found mildly interesting. You were captured carrying no weapons and no communications equipment. Your escort was a civilian transport vessel. You were heading toward the Vel Sarath exclusion zone deliberately. This is, I have to say, one of the stranger voluntary surrenders I've seen. I didn't surrender, Vera said. I came here to talk to you. You could have sent a message. You would have had me killed. I needed you to have me in front of you first. Vorin looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not warmth exactly, but a kind of professional interest. You're right that I would have, he said. I'm still deciding about now. That's fair. She kept her voice level. I know what the Imperium wants the end of this war to look like. I know what you've been building down here. And I know that what Exalted Vorin has been planning in Vel Sarath's lower levels is not a weapon against the sovereignty. The room became very quiet. Vorin's feathers didn't move. That stillness, she knew, was more dangerous than the stiffening. You know nothing about the lower levels. The geothermal converters in the base array aren't operating at their rated capacity, Vera said. We've been measuring the thermal output differentials from the surface for 2 years. The excess energy isn't going into Vel Sarath's power grid. It's going somewhere else. And the drilling operations your engineers have been running on the ocean floor outside the city, they're not resource extraction. The bore patterns don't match mineral vein mapping. They match seismic stress fracture analysis. She watched him. You're trying to breach the planetary mantle, she said. The thermal output of a full mantle breach under this much oceanic pressure would, I asked our best geophysical engineers, and they agreed that the wave function would be catastrophic. Not for one continent, not for one ocean, for all of it. Vorin said nothing for a very long time. Why would I want that? He said finally. It was not a question. I don't know, Vera said. I thought that by coming here I would figure it out. She paused. I think you're very tired. I think the war has been going on longer than anyone wanted it to, and you are the man who has to carry the weight of what it costs. And I think at some point in the last few years you stopped wanting to win it and started wanting it to stop. In the worst possible way. The silence stretched out between them like a physical thing. Remarkable, Vorin said quietly. Completely wrong, of course. He looked at her with something that was almost sadness. Nothing in the world can stop me now. That is not a boast. It is a technical assessment. He had her taken to a residential cell on the 14th level. It was not uncomfortable. That was its own kind of horror. The cell was warm and had real food and a sleeping surface that was better than most of the field cots she'd used in 15 years of war. The Imperium imprisoned you in comfort when they had decided your existence was a temporary administrative matter. She sat on the edge of the sleeping surface and put her hand against her stomach and felt her daughter move, a slow, fluid roll, like something dreaming, and spent exactly 1 minute allowing herself to feel the fear before she put it in a box and locked it. She had work to do. The guard situation was straightforward. There were 2 outside her door and a rotating third on the level corridor. The door was a standard VETH pressure-sealed barrier, requiring a biometric from an authorized personnel list to open from the outside. From the inside it required nothing, which told her they had not considered her a physical threat, which was either accurate or a very significant mistake on their part. The ventilation system ran behind the east wall. She could hear it. She had been sitting for about 2 hours when the section of east wall behind the sleeping surface shifted, very slightly, and then a panel came loose in small, careful increments, and a face appeared in the gap. It was a woman, young, Urkin marked on both hands, with the gill structures visible along her throat, currently retracted. She had very large eyes behind the membrane lenses that were currently contracted away from her irises. She looked at Vera with the expression of someone who has done an enormously dangerous thing and is now committed to it regardless of how it turns out. You walked through the market, the woman whispered. You looked at us. I did, Vera said. My name is Kessa. I'm a food production technician on the 3rd cultivation level. She said this with a kind of precision, The way people stated their names and positions when they were about to do something that might make those things cease to exist. The Urkin have been talking about what to do for a long time. There are 6,000 of us in Vel-Sarath. We run the farms. We run the water processing. We run the geothermal maintenance cycles. Without us, the city lasts about 3 days before the power grid starts failing. Vera looked at her steadily. How long have you been planning? 2 years. We didn't know how to start. Kessa's expression did something complicated. We needed someone from outside, someone who, she stopped. Someone who would walk through the market without flinching. Kessa nodded. Vera thought about the thermal output readings. She thought about the drilling operations. She thought about what Voron had said, nothing in the world can stop me, and the specific quality of certainty in it. Not arrogance, certainty. There's a timeline, Vera said, for whatever he's building in the lower levels. Do you know it? Kessa was quiet. 48 hours, she said finally. We hear things. The Urkin who work the deep maintenance shafts come up talking about the drilling progress. The bore is close. 48 hours, maybe less. Vera processed that. All right, she said. Here's what we're going to do. The passage through the ventilation system was not designed for a woman 6 months pregnant, but very few things that needed doing in the next 48 hours were going to be designed for her specifically. Kessa moved through the ductwork with the ease of someone who had mapped this system over years, small and quick, turning and compressing in ways that spoke of long practice. Vera followed her with considerably less grace, her hand against the wall for orientation, navigating by sound, and the dim bioluminescent strips Kessa wore around her wrists. At one point, the duct narrowed sharply around a structural junction, and Vera had to flatten herself and turn sideways, and she became very aware of the specific geometry of her current situation. 6 months, an underwater city 12 kilometers below the surface, a ventilation system designed for maintenance workers rather than fugitives. And she made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a curse, something in between, something that had no word in either Orcish or Veth. Almost through, Kessa whispered. I know, Vera said, I'm fine. She was not entirely fine, but she was functional, and functional was the correct metric right now. They came out in a maintenance corridor on the 9th level, 200 meters from the residential block. The city hummed around them, the deep bone vibration of the geothermal converters, the lower thrum of the water pumping systems, the constant ambient sound of a place that had to work continuously to keep 12,000 people alive at the bottom of an ocean. Vera had asked Kessa to bring her 3 things. Kessa had brought all 3. The first was a clean laborer's tunic and wrist strap to cover her magcuff marks. The second was a Vel-Sarath maintenance clearance token, a cloned copy, stolen from a supervisor's office by one of Kessa's network, that would let her pass through mid-level access points without triggering alerts. The third was a rough schematic of the lower levels, drawn by hand on pressure-resistant film by the deep maintenance Urkin workers, who had been quietly mapping the drilling operation for months. She studied the schematic in the thin light of Kessa's wrist strips. There was something about the draftsmanship that stopped her for a moment. The lines were careful and precise, drawn over what must have been multiple sessions, different ink weights, slightly different hands contributing different sections, annotations in at least 3 distinct handwriting styles. 6 or 7 people, she estimated, working in stolen minutes over the course of a year, passing the document between them through the same networks they used for everything else, contributing what they knew of the systems they worked. It was one of the most collaborative documents she had ever seen, and it had been made in the kind of darkness where getting caught with it meant something terrible. She smoothed it flat against the wall and memorized it. The bore was in sublevel 7, the deepest accessible section of the city. The primary drilling apparatus was surrounded by Voron's command infrastructure, his technical staff, his security forces, the operational center of the whole project. Getting to it directly was not realistic. But the water pumping systems that maintained Vel Sarath's pressure integrity ran through every level, and the control nodes for those systems were distributed throughout the city. She could see two of them clearly on the schematic, at positions that also happened to be adjacent to the main power conduit junctions. "If I flood the lower 3 sublevels," she said quietly, "does the drilling apparatus stop?" Kessa said, "Yes, but so does the power grid for about a quarter of the city, including life support in the residential blocks and the cultivation level where most of the Urkin live." "How long before backup systems engage?" 4 minutes. "In the drilling apparatus, once stopped by flooding, how long to restart?" Kessa looked at the schematic. "The engineers who work the bore say the drill heads have to be pressure equalized before they can run again. If the chamber floods completely, that's 6 hours minimum." Vera thought about the timeline. 48 hours originally. She didn't know how many of those hours were left. She thought about 4 minutes of darkness in the residential blocks. She thought about 12,000 people, Veth and Urkin, and the various other populations the Imperium had swept into this city, and what 4 minutes of life support interruption meant in practical terms. She thought about her daughter. "We're going to need the Urkin to move their people to the upper levels before we trigger the flood," she said. "All of them, above level 9. "Can your network do that in, how much time do we have?" "Maybe 12 hours before Vorin notices you're gone from the cell." "Then we have 12 hours to move 6,000 people upward without the overseers understanding what they're doing." Vera paused. "That's not possible." "No," Kessa agreed. They looked at each other in the thin light. "Unless the overseers have a reason to want everyone upward anyway," Vera said slowly. "Unless there's a reason the upper levels are where everyone should be." Kessa was quiet for a moment, then she said, "The food." Vera looked at her. "The plankton cultures," Kessa said. "The whole food supply for the city runs through the cultivation level. We grow it, we process it, we distribute it. If the cultivation level stops producing, if we simply stop, the city has food reserves for about 36 hours. After that, the distribution system starts rationing. After 48 hours, the markets start failing." She paused. "If the overseers believe there's a production failure in the cultivation level, they'll want inspection teams up there. They'll want to move all available technical staff upward to assess. It's standard Imperium protocol. And the Urkin who are already up there dealing with a production failure," Vera said, "will need to be joined by the rest of the Urkin from the lower levels for the assessment crew." Kessa nodded slowly. "It would take us about 6 hours to make it look like a genuine systems failure. The bioluminescent cultures need a specific light frequency to maintain yield. If we adjust the light parameters by hand, across all the cultivation tanks simultaneously, the yield drops to near zero within 4 hours, and then the systems fail in a pattern that reads as equipment malfunction rather than sabotage." "Can you do that without being caught?" "The cultivation level has 40 Urkin staff during the current shift. The overseers have 4 people on inspection rotation. The overseers won't notice the light adjustments because they don't understand the biology well enough to see what they mean." A very small smile crossed Kessa's face. "They never do." Vera put her hand against the wall of the duct for a moment and breathed. This was the thing she had not expected when they dragged her through the pressure gates. Not the scale of the threat, not the brutality of the operation, but this. The 6,000 people who had been building a plan for 2 years without anyone to start it with. The woman who had dismantled a wall panel in the dark because a stranger had walked through a market with her back straight. She thought about Durin. She thought about the way he had believed, absolutely and without reservation, that the people under their care were the whole point. Not the land, not the legacy, not the history, the people. She had argued with him about it sometimes in the early years. She had been more strategic than him, more comfortable thinking in terms of territories and resources and long-game calculations. He had always listened to her arguments, and then told her she was right about the tactics and missing the point. She had thought he was being sentimental. She understood now, in the way you understand things that cost you everything to learn, that he had been right, and that the point he had never been missing was standing in front of her with 3-year-old Vey waiting somewhere above level 9, and a 2-year plan sketched on pressure-resistant film. "Your daughter," Kessa said quietly. Vera looked at her. "I noticed when you first came through the panel," Kessa said. "I didn't say anything because," she stopped. "My daughter was born down here. She's 3 years old. She's never seen the sky." Vera held that. "Then we'd better make sure she does," she said. The next 10 hours were the most precise and terrifying work Vera had done since the Ashfin crossing, which had involved artillery and a river and 12,000 soldiers. And this was somehow harder because it was quiet. Quiet and invisible and dependent entirely on a network of people who trusted each other in the specific way that the long-oppressed learned to trust completely and without paperwork. Kessa's network was extraordinary. It had no name. It had no hierarchy. It had instead a series of relationships built over years in the cramped shared spaces of the cultivation level and the maintenance corridors and the flooded work chambers. A woman who serviced the water pumps and knew which valves to turn. A man who did electrical maintenance and knew which panels in the power conduit room were not actually locked. A pair of sisters who ran the deep maintenance schedule and had been quietly documenting the drilling operation for 14 months. All of them had been waiting. All of them had been afraid. Vera moved between them through the ductwork and the service corridors with Kessa as her navigator and her guide, and gradually, as something she did not have a word for, not quite a friend, not yet, but the person who had decided to stand in the same dangerous place you were standing in, and that was its own kind of intimacy. The cultivation level began its false failure at hour 3 of the plan. The bioluminescent cultures dimmed, one tank array at a time, and the yield monitors began showing the cascade decline that Kessa's team had engineered. By hour 4, the overseer duty station was receiving automated alerts. By hour 5, the first VETH technical inspection team arrived on the cultivation level and found 600 confused Urkin technicians gesturing at failing equipment and providing technically accurate but creatively misleading explanations. The Overseer Command made the expected decision: all Urkin technical staff to be concentrated on the cultivation level for crisis assessment, all residential and lower-level Urkin populations temporarily relocated to the upper communal areas while the situation was assessed. Standard Imperium crisis protocol. Efficient. Predictable. By hour 8, the vast majority of the Urkin in Velsareth were above level 9. Vera was in sub-level 3 when the first alert about her missing cell went out. She heard it on the VETH internal communication band. She had taken a receiver from the maintenance supervisor's station on level 7. Another item Kessa's network had identified and flagged: a flat, toneless announcement that the detention subject on level 14 had been found absent, and a search was being initiated. She was 2 levels below the primary water pumping control junction. "How long until they reach the cultivation level inspection?" she asked Kessa. 20 minutes, maybe 30. When they find out the production failure was staged, they'll know. Kessa's voice was very steady. Vorin will know everything. Vera thought about what Vorin had said. Nothing in the world can stop me now. Technical assessment. Then we need to be done in 15, she said. The water pumping control junction for the lower 3 sublevels was a room the size of a large closet, filled with pressure regulation equipment and valve control panels, and the constant sound of water moving under enormous force through the pipes in the walls. It smelled of brine and hot metal. Kessa's electrical maintenance contact, a man named Save, compact and deliberate, with scars on both hands from the induction marks, was already there, had been there for the last hour, had disabled 2 of the 3 alert sensors on the control panel and was working on the third. "The third one's a problem," he said when they came through the panel. He didn't look up. "Different circuit design than the other 2. I can't pull it without triggering a signal at the command station." "What happens if you leave it?" "When we flood the lower levels, the alert fires to the command station. They'll know what we've done." "They're going to know in 15 minutes anyway," Vera said. She looked at the valve control panel. "Show me what to do." Save looked at her for the first time. He looked at her the way people looked at her when they were recalibrating expectations. "You've done pressure system engineering." "I've destroyed 3 Imperial bridge structures at the Ashfin crossing using targeted hydraulic overload." She kept her voice even. "Which is not the same thing, but involves some overlapping principles." Save almost smiled. It was a very small almost smile, the expression of a man who has been doing a terrifying thing alone in a closet-sized room for an hour, and has just been joined by someone who has also done terrifying things and is not pretending otherwise. He turned back to the panel. "The primary flood initiation is the red console on the left. It requires simultaneous input at 3 points. The top 2 switches and the main pressure release valve, held for 8 seconds. That's a 2-person operation. 1 person has to hold the top switches, and the other has to hold the pressure release." "When the lower levels flood," Vera said, "where does the water go?" "It equalizes through the sub-level drainage network and the bore chamber. The bore chamber is sealed, so the pressure will build against the drill heads and the drilling apparatus housing until the structural tolerance is exceeded. After that," Save shrugged, "after that it's a sealed underwater chamber with a lot of pressure in it. The bore head will be destroyed." "And the rest of the drilling operation?" "The energy arrays that power the drill are in sub-level 5. Flooding the bore chamber pushes back up through the power conduits. The arrays will short." He paused. "The structural damage to sub-level 5 through 7 will be significant." "Significant as in unrepairable in 6 hours, or significant as in we all die?" "The former, if we're above level 3 when it happens. The load-bearing structure of sub-level 1 through 3 is rated to contain the pressure differential. It'll hold." He did not look certain. Vera thought about the people above level 9. She thought about Kessa's daughter who had never seen the sky. She thought about the 48-hour timeline, how many of those hours she had spent in a cell and in the ductwork and in these conversations, and how she did not actually know how close Voron's bore was to completion. She put her hand on the pressure release valve. The metal was cold. The vibration of the water moving through the pipes was in it, a faint trembling that traveled up through her palm and into her arm. She stood for a moment holding it, feeling that trembling, and she thought about what Duran had said once after the first battle they had won together, which had been a desperate and chaotic thing won by margins so thin they barely existed. He had said, "There is no clean version of this. You just do the thing and then you deal with what it costs afterward." She had asked him what he meant because they had won, and he had said, "We're dealing with it right now. The winning is the cost. The cost is that we have to do it again." She had not understood him completely then. She understood him now. Kessa moved to the top switches. "Tell me about your daughter," Vera said. Kessa looked at her, a surprised look, not offended, just surprised. "Her name is Vey," Kessa said. "She is 3 years old and she likes the bioluminescent cultures because they're the prettiest light she's ever seen, and she doesn't know yet that there's any other kind of light." Her voice was absolutely steady. "She asks me sometimes what the sun is. I've described it to her, but I'm not sure the description lands because I haven't seen it myself in 4 years, and I think my description has gotten imprecise." Vera thought about sunlight on the Orc Highlands. She thought about the quality of it in the late afternoon, the way it turned the volcanic stone amber and warm. She thought about how her mother had described it to her once, when she was very young and they were inside waiting out a storm, the way you describe a thing to make it real for someone who can't see it, Like the city is wearing something it doesn't usually show you, she had said. Like the stone remembers when it was fire. She thought about showing her daughter that. When this is over, Vera said, I will personally take you and Vey to the highest point of the Ashfin Highlands, and you can both look at the sun for as long as you want. You can make your description precise again. Kessa looked at her, something settled in her face. All right, she said. They held for 8 seconds. The sound was enormous. Not an explosion, more like the world deciding to breathe in a different direction. The pumping room vibrated through the walls, through the floor, through the soles of their feet. The pipes in the walls began to scream with pressure change, a high sustained note that climbed past hearing into something felt in the teeth and the chest. The alert sensor save hadn't been able to disconnect began firing immediately, a red pulsing light on the panel, a distant klaxon starting somewhere on the command level. Go, Save said. They went. The ductwork back toward the upper levels was not the same route they had come down. Kessa had planned 3 alternate routes, which was either excellent forethought or evidence of how long she had been planning for a scenario exactly like this one. They moved through the maintenance passages at a speed that was not quite running, but was not quite walking, the distant sound of Vel Sareth's emergency systems beginning to activate somewhere behind and below them. On level 6, they hit a patrol. 2 Veth security officers, moving fast, clearly responding to the alert. They came around a service corridor intersection and stopped when they saw Vera and Kessa, and for one moment everyone was very still. Vera had the maintenance clearance token still in her pocket. She held it up. Urkin technical staff responding to cultivation level emergency, she said. Her Veth was not perfectly accented, but it was functional, and she kept her voice in the flat administrative register of someone who was doing a tedious job and was mildly irritated at having to explain it. The cultivation director ordered all technical staff to reporting stations. The guards looked at the token. They looked at Kessa, who had the Urkin marks and the gill structures and the correct shift tunic. They looked at Vera. She met the nearer guard's eyes and kept her expression at the precise intersection of inconvenienced and impatient. Not aggressive, not afraid, just a technical worker who had somewhere to be. Cultivation level is upward, the guard said. I know, Vera said, that's where I'm going. A beat the distant klaxon. The vibration in the floor that was the lower levels, reorganizing themselves around several million liters of new water. The guard stepped aside. They walked past him without looking back. At level 4 the lights failed. Not all at once, in sectors, the amber yellow dropping out in sequence as the power conduit junctions in the lower levels began to go dark. Emergency strips activated in the corridors, casting everything in a colder blue-white that made the passage feel underwater even while they were moving through air. People were moving in the corridors now, Veth citizens, administrative workers, a cluster of children from what looked like an educational facility, all of them reacting to the alarms and the failing light with the practiced controlled panic of people who lived in an underwater city and had rehearsed emergency protocols. Vera moved through them with her head down and her hands moving naturally at her sides. Kessa stayed half a step behind her and slightly to her left, which was where she had been for the last 8 hours, and which Vera had noticed was where Kessa instinctively positioned herself relative to anyone she trusted. They were at level 9, above the critical threshold, in the area where the Urkin population had been consolidated, when Vera heard the voice. It was Vorin. He was not panicking. She had not expected him to be. He was on the internal communication band, his voice flat and precise, issuing orders to his security forces with the tone of a man who had contemplated the possibility of plans failing and had prepared accordingly. The flooding of the lower levels was confirmed. The bore chamber was compromised. The drilling operation was, there was a pause in his voice here, very small, the first crack in the certainty, interrupted. Not stopped, interrupted. She understood the distinction. 48 hours had been the timeline for completion. If the bore was close, if it was close enough, the delay imposed by the flooding might not be enough. 6 hours to restart, Kessa had said. Did Vorin have 6 hours to spare? She found a quiet alcove near the level 9 communal area and pulled out the schematic and the communications receiver and thought very fast. 6,000 Urkin were now concentrated above her. Vorin's security forces, she estimated 400, based on what she'd observed moving through the city, were currently dealing with the emergency in the lower levels. The city's administrative structure was in crisis mode. The Veth civilian population of roughly 6,000 were managing their own emergency response. The door between Vel Sarath and the outside ocean was the main pressure lock on level 1, 300 meters above her. How many Urkin have any kind of combat experience? She asked Kessa quietly. Kessa considered this. Define combat. Have they ever had to physically overpower someone? The overseers, Kessa said it without emphasis. The induction process. When people were first brought in, many of us fought, she paused. We lost, but we fought. Not combat as in military tactics. Combat as in 6,000 people who know how to resist, who are now above level 9, who outnumber the Veth security forces by 15 to 1. Vera looked at her. What I need to know is whether they're ready. Kessa was quiet for a long time. 2 years, she said finally. We've been talking about this for 2 years. That's not the same as being ready. No, Kessa agreed, but there is a difference between being ready and being willing. We are willing. She looked at Vera. Are you going to lead us? Vera thought about what leadership had cost her. 15 years of it. The Ashvin crossing. Durin. The smoking ruin of a defensive line that had held for 18 months and then hadn't. She thought about her daughter's first day above water. Hypothetical and terrifying and real. I'm going to show you what the door looks like, she said. You're going to decide whether to walk through it. What happened in the next 3 hours was not, strictly speaking, a battle. It was more like a city changing its mind about who it belonged to. The Urkin did not fight the way armies fought. They did not have the weapons or the training. What they had was 6,000 people who knew every maintenance corridor, every ventilation shaft, every junction box and pressure valve and access panel in Vel Sarath, because they had built half of it and maintained all of it for years, and they had a plan that had been refined through 2 years of careful conversation in the cramped shared spaces of the cultivation level. They moved through the city's infrastructure the way water moves, not forcing, not breaking, finding the paths of least resistance and following them. The food distribution network went dark because the Urkin who operated it simply stopped operating it. The water processing system went to minimum function because the Urkin who maintained it recalibrated it to minimum function and then stood at the junction points in groups of 30 and looked at anyone who tried to recalibrate it back. The power regulation system went to emergency only because the Urkin who ran it decided that emergency only was the appropriate level. Vel Sarath did not go dark, it dimmed. Vorin's security forces responded as trained security forces do. They responded to the things they could see, the obvious points of conflict, the people standing at the junction points. What they couldn't respond to was the absence. You can fight people who are in front of you. You cannot fight the absence of 6,000 workers who have collectively decided to stop. Vera was at the main pressure lock on level 1 when Vorin found her. She had expected him to send security forces. He came himself with 4 guards, walking through the dimmed corridor with the same compact quiet she had observed in the ceremonial chamber. He stopped when he saw her standing at the pressure lock controls. He looked at the controls. He looked at her. His guards fanned out to either side, and there was a moment where everything was very still. She was aware, very precisely, of the weight of iron on the cord around her neck. She was aware of her daughter. She was aware of the level 9 communal area 3 floors above them, where 6,000 Urkin were waiting in the amber and blue dim of a city that had gone to minimum function, waiting the way they had learned to wait, with the patience of people who have been waiting for a long time, and know that patience is not the same as resignation. She did not reach for the pressure lock controls. She kept her hands at her sides and looked at Voron and waited. "You've flooded my bore chamber," he said. "Yes. You've organized a worker action across the entire city." "They organized it themselves. I showed up at a useful moment." He looked at her for a long time. His feathers were flat against his skull, the gray of age and something else, something she read as exhaustion. The deep, structural exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something too heavy for too long. "You know what the bore was for," he said. "I told you what I thought. You told me I was completely wrong." She watched him. "Were you lying?" Voron didn't answer immediately. He walked to the side of the corridor and leaned against the wall, not a defeated lean, but the lean of someone who has been standing for a very long time and has simply stopped pretending that isn't true. "The war," he said. "Do you know how many worlds the Imperium has taken in the last 3 centuries? I know the number on your floor. 1,412. I have been party to the administration of the most recent 60. I have signed the requisitions for labor induction in Vel Sarath and 11 other installations like it. I have reviewed the casualty assessments for the Ashvin campaign, including the report on Warlord Durin's unit." His voice did not change. "Your husband died because I approved the artillery targeting matrix." The corridor was very quiet. "I know," Vera said. Voron looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not quite surprise, but the adjustment of someone who has spent a long time expecting a specific reaction and is not getting it. "I've known for a year," she said. "I came here because of it. I didn't come here for revenge. I came here because you're the person who approved it, and you're also the person who apparently decided at some point to stop the Imperium by destroying everything, including the thing you were trying to save." She paused. "That doesn't work. I've watched a lot of people try it. The ending is always the same." She thought about what that kind of grief could do to a person. She was not without understanding of it. She had spent 3 months after Ashvin trying to figure out what she was supposed to be now, how you continued to function as a thing that had been shaped around a person who no longer existed. She had not resolved it. She had just continued. And continuing had eventually produced something that was not the same shape as before but was still functional, still hers, still capable of walking into an underwater city at 6 months pregnant, and talking a madman back from the edge of planetary destruction. That was what Voron had not been able to do. He had stopped continuing. He had found instead the terrible clarity of someone who has decided that the problem is too large to solve in any livable direction, and the only remaining option is to make it impossible for the problem to persist. She understood that. She did not agree with it. "The bore," she said. "How close?" 12 hours, he said. "The flooding bought you 6. After the chamber is cleared and the drill heads repressurized, 12 hours. And the restart protocol, who controls it?" 3 engineers in sub-level 5, my personal access code. He looked at her, and my willingness to give it. She understood what he was telling her. "The Urkin are above level 9, she said. "The main pressure lock opens to the ocean floor. From there, it's a 4-hour ascent in the submersibles to the nearest surface point." She kept her eyes on him. "The Imperium's nearest surface installation is 7 days away. If Vel Sarath is evacuated and the pressure lock is sealed from outside, the city's life support goes to minimum function. The bore loses power by default." "The city would be uninhabitable within a month," Voron said. "The city is already uninhabitable," Vera said. "It's just that 12,000 people are living in it anyway." Another silence, different from the others, something resolving rather than resisting. My engineers will have questions about the decompression protocols for ascent, Voron said. Kessa's people have been running the submersible maintenance for 4 years, Vera said. They know the decompression protocols better than your engineers do. I imagine they do. He looked at the pressure lock controls. I'll need to give the abort code to my technical staff. It will require my physical presence in sub-level 5. Then you should go, Vera said. He looked at her one more time. It was not the look she had expected from a man in his position. It was not defeat exactly, and it was not relief. It was something older and quieter. The look of someone who has been carrying a decision for a long time and has finally set it down somewhere and walked away from it, and is now discovering with some surprise that their hands are empty. Your husband was a good soldier, he said. I want you to know that the assessment said that, in the report. She held that. I know, she said. He went. She stayed at the pressure lock and watched the corridor and thought about Durin, briefly and specifically, and without resolution. The way you think about the people you carry with you when there is nothing left to do but wait. Kessa found her there 40 minutes later. He gave the abort code, Kessa said. The bore is offline. The engineering team is already beginning the drill head removal. Without the heads in place, the chamber is structurally stable but permanently non-functional for this purpose. She paused. He also released the biometric authorizations for the residential cell blocks. All non-Urkin detainees in Vel Sarath, there are about 300, are free. Vera let out a breath. The submersibles, she said. How many can we run simultaneously? 12, each carrying 60 people. We can cycle them. The ascent is 4 hours. Turnaround at surface is 2. Descent is 4, so about 10 hours per cycle. Full evacuation at that rate, Kessa did the calculation. 36 hours for everyone, including Veth citizens. Kessa looked at her. Including everyone, she said, and there was something very deliberate in her voice, the deliberateness of someone who has thought about this question and made a specific choice. Including Voron, Vera said. A longer pause, including Voron. The evacuation of Vel Sarath took 31 hours. It did not go smoothly. Nothing involving 12,000 people and a city in structural decline goes smoothly. There were arguments and panics, and a section of the level 4 corridor that partially flooded due to a secondary pressure system failure unrelated to their sabotage, which required 40 minutes of rerouting and a shouted navigation argument between 2 of Kessa's engineers that was resolved by one of them simply walking the other route first and yelling back that it was fine. There were 3 Veth citizens who refused to board the submersibles because they believed the ascent itself was a trap, and Vera spent 40 minutes she didn't have talking them through it, which she did not regret because she had been afraid of things too, and someone had once stood with her in that fear and stayed with her until it was manageable. Voron gave the abort code from sub-level 5 with his 4 guards watching and none of them stopping him, which told her something about what he had become to his own people. He came up in the 5th cycle with the engineers who had built the drill, and she did not speak to him again until much later. There was time for that conversation. There would have to be. Vera went in the 4th submersible cycle, which was not when she had planned to go. She had planned the second to last. But Kessa had pointed out with some force that a 6-month pregnant woman spending 31 hours in an underground city that was currently in various stages of controlled decompression was a medical liability, and that furthermore Vey was asking for her mother, and the child would like very much to see the sky from the highlands if that was still on offer. And perhaps this could happen sooner rather than later. The submersible was an old model, Urkin maintained for 4 years, which meant it ran better than anything Imperium official, because the people whose lives depended on it had actually cared about whether it worked. It held 312 people in rows of padded bench seating that had been retrofitted from the original cargo configuration, by someone who had understood that the distinction between freight and people matters. Vera sat in the back row and watched the level indicators on the ascent panel climb through the numbers. The ascent took 4 hours and 20 minutes. When the submersible's upper hatch broke the ocean surface, the light came in before anything else. It came in at the angle of late afternoon, the specific amber-warm quality of it that Vera had been trying to describe to herself for 31 hours of underground work, the quality she had told Kessa she would show her, the quality that you simply could not make precise with words because it was not made of words. Vey pressed her face to the porthole. She didn't say anything. She was 3 years old and she had been born underground and she had never seen light like this. And there are no words for it in any language when it is the first time, and she understood that better than any adult because she had not yet learned to substitute the word for the thing. She put her palm flat against the glass, the way you touch something you are not sure is real, and the light came through her fingers and lit them from behind, and she made a small sound that was not any kind of language. Kessa was sitting next to her daughter with her hand on Vey's back, and her face was doing something complicated and certain and complete that Vera did not have a word for either. After a moment, Kessa reached up and pressed her own hand against the porthole next to her daughter's, so that their hands were side by side in the light, and she said something to Vey very quietly that Vera could not hear from the back of the compartment. Whatever it was, Vey turned to look at her mother, and then turned back to the light and made the sound again. There were 312 Urkin in this submersible cycle, and every one of them who was near a porthole was looking at the light. Vera sat in the back with her hand against her stomach and felt her daughter move, not the slow rolling dream motion she had felt in the cell, but something more definite, more awake, more pointed towards something and thought about names. She had not chosen a name yet. She had been waiting. She had not wanted to name her for a future she wasn't certain they'd reach. They had reached it. She thought about Durin one more time, specifically and without resolution as was her habit, and she thought, I will tell her about you. I will tell her everything I remember about the way you believed the people were the whole point. I will make sure she understands. She thought about what it would mean to grow up knowing that. To have that in the ground of you from the beginning, not learned the hard way but simply given, the way sunlight is given, whether or not you understand the mechanism. She thought her daughter would be something she could not quite imagine yet. She found she was looking forward to finding out. She thought about Vorin on the last submersible, the man who had signed the targeting matrix and spent 2 years trying to end the war by ending the world, who had looked at the abort code panel and chosen the other option. She did not know what to do with him. There would be complicated things ahead, negotiations with a destabilized Imperium, the status of the Urkin populations, the question of the other 11 installations like Vel Sarath. She would have to be involved in all of it. She was the widow of the warlord and the queen of a sovereignty that had just helped evacuate an enemy city, and she had absolutely no idea how the political architecture of the next 50 years was going to work. That was fine, she had never known. You never did at the beginning. The submersible was 3 hours from the surface station, when the field radio the Urkin engineers had retrofitted to the old vessel's communication array picked up a signal from the Sovereignty emergency frequency. She listened to it twice to make sure she had it right. A Sovereignty advance team had been tracking the submersible ascent from the surface. They had a ship waiting. They had medical staff and supplies. They had a communications array she could use to contact the Imperium High Command, who were, the signal indicated, currently in a state of considerable political confusion following the discovery that the Vel Sarath Bohr operation had been shut down by its own architect. The political confusion had created. The signal concluded with the flat understatement of an intelligence officer used to delivering unlikely news, what appeared to be an opening. Vera sat with that for a while. She thought about an opening. She thought about what an opening meant after 15 years of a war that had consumed everything she had loved and made her into something harder and more functional, and less certain about the value of hardness. She thought about the difference between an opening and a door. An opening you could walk through by accident. A door you had to decide to open. She thought about the people on this submersible. She thought about the 11 other cities like Vel-Sarath. She thought about what it would mean to do this right, slowly, carefully, for as long as it took, not the desperate and chaotic winning by margins that the last 15 years had been, but something more deliberate, something that accounted for the cost before you spent it. She thought about Vey at the porthole with her face in the light. She reached for the radio. "This is Queen Vera of the Second Sovereignty," she said. "Tell them I'm coming. And tell them," she paused, trying to find the right words, the ones that were not the words of a general or a diplomat or a widow, but of whatever she was becoming here on the ascent, in this narrow vessel full of people heading toward the first light any of them had seen in years. She thought about what she had said to Kessa in the cell. "I came here because I needed you to have me in front of you first. Tell them to expect a different kind of conversation than they're used to," she said. "Tell them I'm bringing people with me who have been waiting a long time to be part of one." She put the radio down. Behind her, she heard Vey say something to her mother. She heard Kessa laugh, a real laugh, unguarded, the laugh of someone who has put down something very heavy and has not yet gotten used to the absence of the weight. She heard 300 other people adjusting in their seats, leaning toward the portholes, talking quietly, the particular sound of people who have decided not to be afraid anymore and are still getting used to what that feels like. Outside the porthole, the sun was doing what the sun does, burning itself to nothing to keep the whole system warm, not because it decided to, but because that was simply its nature, and she thought that was, when you looked at it right, the best possible metaphor for what she was trying to do. The light got slowly, steadily, incontrovertibly brighter. She let it,